Oh, goody.
Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. In this one, we're doing a tier list for all the new cards that are coming out in Series or Pool 4 and 5. So quite a few cards here, and much like in my Pool 3 tier list, instead of doing traditional S, A, B, C, etc., I thought it was more interesting and potentially more accurate to label things as they are here. New archetype defining, good in existing decks, good on its own, fringe playable, not currently playable. As I don't think anyone, even the best players in the game, are really able to tell some of these new build around cards how good they're going to be. It's really kind of hard to evaluate things like Galactus and Thanos until we actually get our hands on the card. So I think any tier list that is telling you, hey, this card is going to be broken, it's probably not going to be super accurate. So I wanted to focus on something that I think is a little easier to rank here, and that's kind of what these cards potentially represent. And you can kind of use that a bit to determine, hey, is this a card I want to acquire once we see how some of these new cards are working out in their new decks. So let's start out here with Absorbing Man. So Absorbing Man is a Series 4 card, 4 cost, 3 power, on reveal, copy the last on reveal card you played. So kind of like Mystique, but for on reveal cards. I think this card's pretty powerful. Obviously he will be good in existing shells too, but I do think he is just generically strong enough, and there are not too many great 4-drops in the game right now to where you can run this in a pretty wide variety of decks and it will just be good. I think the 4-drop slot is one of the weakest slots in Marvel Snap right now, where you're really not seeing too many 4-cost cards, the main ones being some tech cards like Enchantress or Shang-Chi or Jessica Jones and Rescue, but outside of those, not seeing a whole ton of 4-cost cards. So I think this definitely has a place in the game. I think even though it will be good in on-reveal focused decks, enough decks usually have at least a handful of on-reveals, even if that's not their central focus. So I think he's just going to be a good card on his own that makes his way into a pretty wide variety of decks. Next up, we have Agent Coulson. This is another Pool 4 card, and he costs 3, 4 power, and on reveal, put a 4 and 5 cost card into your hand. Now, these are generated randomly, but I think this is definitely going to find a home in the Devil Dinosaur decks. Obviously, Devil Dino, very powerful and popular archetype, especially in the lower pools, and this just seems like a really nice inclusion that keeps your hand size big and gives you potentially some stuff to play on the follow-up turns if you don't necessarily have great on-curve options. Next up is Attuma, and I think he is deserving of the good in existing builds. So basically what this card does, 4 cost, 10 power, but he has a downside, and that downside is if you have another card here at the end of your turn, destroy this. So I think this is a card that is very easily disruptible, where your opponent plays a Debris or a Green Goblin or a Hobgoblin, or even just some locations that can mess you up, where even though the rate here is good, it's very easy for this card to get removed. That said, I do think this can be good in existing builds, namely the ongoing decks. And the big reason for this is armor, because armor is going to prevent it from getting destroyed, whether that be from an opponent's Shang-Chi or just from his own negative effect. Armor is going to make it a lot easier for a card like this to actually see play. I don't think you will really see too much of him outside of armor ongoing lists. It's possible over time, maybe we get some more payoffs to these, have a singular card here, as there's another one in here we're going to talk about that's like that. But for the time being, it doesn't seem like these cards are overstated enough to make up for their big downside outside of places where, you can get around that negative effect. Another place this could see play is in the 0 decks, where they either try and cancel the negative effect with 0, or you just eat it up with Venom, so that way you just don't have to worry about the negative effect, but you get all the benefits of the power. So those are some existing shells I think this card could work in, and I can definitely see people experimenting with it there. Next up is our first Pool 5 card here, and that is going to be Bast. Now, I think Bast either deserves a spot at the very top or just below the top in good and existing builds. A little hard to say, as I don't think you're going to see this completely reinvent a new archetype, so I think it's safe to put it in good and existing builds, but I think this is a very, very powerful effect, and you're especially going to see a lot of it in zoo-style decks, to where you're buffing up the base power of all your good, cheap cards to 3. And that's pretty strong. Zoo is actually, I think, a pretty underrepresented archetype relative to its power. You know, a lot of people stop playing it after they get into Pool 3 because of Killmonger, but it can definitely still be strong. And I've seen a number of people end up hitting Infinite with it, even being in Pool 3. I think this card is just going to be very, very good in Zoo decks. You get it on 1, it is a huge amount of boost to your power. It's also a 1-drop itself, so you can boost it up with things like Khazar. And another home I could see this card finding is probably in maybe Cerebro 3, where we're trying to make all our cards cost 3, so this could open up some diversity in the cards we could run that aren't 3 power, trying to make them 3 power so we gain the value from our Cerebro effects. Next up, another Series 5 Pool 5 card here, and that is Galactus. And I think this one is an easy placement into new archetype defining territory, as Galactus is pretty insane. So this card is 6 cost for 3 power. On reveal, if this is your only card here, destroy all other locations. So it turns it into a 1-location game. And this is maybe the card I'm most frightened about, as I do think people are going to find ways to cheat out Galactus early, and it really is kind of the only card here that fundamentally changes how the game is played. Going from having to win 2 out of 3 to having to win 1 out of 1 lanes is a very huge change to the flow of gameplay, and when we're going to potentially see Galactus come out, you know, turn 5, maybe there are even some ways to get him out turn 4, I think that's going to be a really scary deck. Now, it's really hard to evaluate. It's possible this deck is just going to be bad. I think it is definably a new archetype because we haven't had any way to dramatically change how the game is played in a similar way. So I think it's a really cool card. Definitely a little worried about it if it does become a popular meta deck. But it's also possible that since there are a wide variety of counters, that this card never ends up making it into the top tier level. Nonetheless, I think it's very interesting and is going to spawn a totally new deck archetype that we have not seen before. Next up, another Pool 4 card here, and that is Helicarrier. And this is one of the easiest picks, in my opinion. Not currently playable. So what does this card do? 6 cost, 10 power. When you discard this card from your hand, replace it with 3 random cards. Now, I think the idea of what they're doing here is kind of cool. I think the reality is the decks that want to be doing discarding things don't really want this. And if its whole thing is getting value from being discarded, and the discard decks don't want it, well, what's the point? And that's kind of the conclusion I've made with this card here. This is actually one I kind of hope they change, because so the thing with discard decks is you often want to be discarding a lot of your cards in hand, so that way you can discard the things that is beneficial for you to discard. Now Hela, you're trying to discard a bunch of big stuff, so if you discard this in Hela, yeah, you might be able to bring it back, but 10 power isn't crazy compared to some of the other big stuff you could be discarding that is just higher numbers. And you're also putting a bunch of junk in your hand that, yeah, maybe you have more cards to discard, but is that really going to change your game plan or make your game plan a bit more effective? It's another card you have to run to where you're not running discard in its place, so you might have to have less discard or less big top end, and I don't think those are sacrifices that the discard decks are really willing or able to make. Also, in the most popular discard deck, the Lockjaw version, it just doesn't make sense because you're really trying to discard your hand down, so you get either a big card off of Dracula or you can have a big Apocalypse, and this just feels like it kind of gets in the way of both of those game plans. So I think in its current form, Helicarrier really does not have a home, and it's definitely a card I would like to consider them maybe reworking a bit to make it either better in discard or just have it have a whole different effect entirely. Next up is a Luke Cage. This is another Pool 4 card, and I think he is deserving of the new archetype defining card. So what does he do? 2 cost, 1 power, ongoing. Your cards cannot have their power reduced. So I think this is going to spawn a new archetype. Now, do we have enough tools with this kind of synergy to make a new powerful deck? I'm not entirely sure yet. There really aren't a ton of things that this card works with yet. I think the most obvious ones are Hazmat, so you can get your opponent's stuff smaller while keeping your stuff the same size. And then another one is Typhoid Mary, who is just above stats for the cost, but she makes your other stuff smaller, so gets around that. Other than that, I mean, you do also have Yellow Jacket, which is kind of like a beefier version of the Wasp, but makes your things smaller. I don't think that we're going to have the tools for this to be a strong deck yet, but I do think it is going to spawn a new archetype, and as we get more tools that kind of lean into this theme of reducing the power of every card on the field, much like Hazmat, I think this definitely can become a very stellar and important card in those style of decks. I think we are going to need more cards to really see those decks have a lot of success. Next up is Maria Hill, and she is going to join Agent Coulson here in good and existing builds. Her ability is on reveal, add a random 1-cost card to your hand, 2 cost, 3 power. I think this is just a really good 2-drop, and I think it's going to find a home in a lot of decks. There are a lot of powerful 1-drops in the game, but the fact that you're guaranteed a 1-drop I think is better than a lot of random generation in the game, because you can kind of more easily sneak it into a turn where you have 1 extra energy to spare. On top of that, this really just makes a lot of sense in Dino to keep the hand large, and the archetype I'm probably most excited about with the new cards is going to be Cerebro at 3 power, and she just seems really, really good for that kind of deck, because not only is she just a good 2-drop, but she can get you another 1-drop which might have 3 power. She could even get you Bast, which could get you all of your cards to 3 power, which is something you really want. So I think this card is really powerful, and I think it is going to be one of the more played cards from Pool 4. Next up is M'Baku, and he is our second not currently playable card in my opinion. I think he's just bad. I think he is not a good card at all. He's a Pool 4 card, 1 cost, 2 power. If this is in your deck at the end of the game, it leaps to a random location. Much like Helicarrier, I kind of hope this is a card they rework, because it's a cool character, but the power for cost and the effect are both really, really bad. Honestly, I think you'd be better off running a Quicksilver in your deck than this card, and Quicksilver is not a great card. It's just, the odds of you having this in your deck at the end of the game are generally pretty low, and even then, the smaller percentage chance of the time that happens, you're just getting a random +2 additional power to your board, so you don't really have any agency over what lane he is buffing, other than if you fill up some lanes. But I just don't like this card. Maybe if it had higher power or something to make up, it's just like one of the worst 1-drops I think we've seen, and unless they make some changes to it, I do not see where this card will find a home currently. Next up, another Series 4 card here, and that is Orca. Orca has the ability Ongoing, +5 power. If this is your only card here, 6 cost, 9 power. So, where is this one going to find a home? Overall, I think this is kind of a fringe playable card. I don't think it's super bad, but I do think that there are a lot of powerful 6-cost cards in the game, and I think this one definitely is a harder condition to really be worth it for your whole turn 6, or maybe cheating it out into play earlier. We've seen kind of a similar issue with Namor, where 10 power for 4 cost is pretty good, but it's so easily disrupted by locations, opponents' cards, you just wanting to play your own cards, that it feels like there needs to be a bit more support for this kind of archetype of only having one card in a lane and getting a benefit. Because right now it just seems pretty underwhelming compared to decks that can just play a lot of powerful cards in a lane rather than just one big guy. Next up is She-Hulk. This might be my favorite or tied for favorite card of the new drop here. And this one is also a pool 4 card. So she is 6 energy, 10 power, costs 1 less for each unspent energy last turn. I think she definitely is going to be good in existing builds. The places I see her showing up a lot are probably going to be Death Wave decks that try and reduce their death, reduce She-Hulk, get down a wave on turn 5, and then you can get She-Hulk, Death, and a third card all out on turn 6, which is a really powerful swing, especially when your opponent a lot of the times is going to be limited to only playing one card due to the wave effect. So I think she's going to be really, really strong there. And then another place she's going to find a home are in Sunspot Infinite decks, where you're going to be able to make good advantage of the fact that you are pumping your own Sunspot whenever you're setting up your She-Hulk turn. Same thing with the Infinite. So overall, I think really, really powerful card. Might be the best card in Pool 4, and I'm excited to see how she does. Next up here, we have a Pool 5 card, and that is Shuri. So, Shuri is a 4 cost, 2 power, and on reveal, the next card that you play will have its power doubled. So, obviously, very natural synergy with Black Panther here, nothing surprising there. Putting her in the good on its own category, because even though this is obviously good in current on reveal decks and whatnot, I think this is going to be a card that is just so powerful it sees play in a variety of different archetypes, especially ones that maybe we haven't fully seen yet, or ones that haven't been quite as powerful without access to a tool like this. I think one thing that's really cool about this card is it is kind of better than Wong if you're just going for a Black Panther style deck, as it's not as easily counterable, because you can play Shuri in any lane, and then it's not really telegraphed where you're going to play your Black Panther the following lane, especially if you're trying to set up the Aram Zola combo. It's really easy for the opponent just to shut that down with a Cosmo or an Armor, and there's not much you can really do. So I think the flexibility of Shuri not telegraphing what lane you're going to go into makes her a very, very powerful card, and I don't think we're just going to see her in Black Panther decks. Even though obviously it will be good there and it will be good in on-reveal decks, I think this card has much bigger potential for a wide variety of decks that don't necessarily rely solely on having good on-reveal stuff. I think she's just going to be good at doubling the power of a lot of cards, especially maybe some cards we haven't even seen yet. So for that reason, I think she definitely earns her spot in just good on its own, generally powerful card. Next up is the Season Pass card for December, and I think this one is definitely very powerful and has a chance of spawning a new archetype, and that is the Silver Surfer. So Silver Surfer is 3 cost for 0 power. On reveal, give your other 3 cost cards plus 3 power. So another really neat build around here where we can just boost up the power of a lot of our different cards. It really incentivizes you building a deck around 3 cost cards. So I do think we are going to maybe see a new archetype emerge. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw this be a Sarah deck, as Sarah on 5 will enable you to throw down 3 different 3 cost cards on the final turn, one of which could be Silver Surfer. Another home I could see this one finding is in a Mr. Negative deck, as 0 power cards are very good in negative decks because they become essentially free. So I think those are going to be the main places. He'll probably spawn a new archetype around 3 drops, and we'll probably see play in a new variant of Mr. Negative. It's also possible people could try him in Cerebro 3, but I think that one's going to be a bit less likely. Next up here is another Pool 5 card, and that is Super Skrull. This one is a 4 cost for 2 power, ongoing, has the ongoing effects of all enemy cards. So this one I think is going to solidly fall into good on its own. I think there's some risk with playing this card, where sometimes it will be amazing and sometimes it will do nothing. And it really depends on what the opponent's deck is. So this is going to very much be a meta call kind of card, as it's not always going to be generically good, as not every opponent runs ongoing effects. But if ongoing is a big part of the meta, kind of like it is right now, I think this card has the potential to be very, very powerful, copying things like Devil Dino, Iron Man, even smaller effects like Cosmo or Armor. It's just a very powerful card for its cost, and I think if ongoing is a good part of the meta, this card will be too. Next up, one of the coolest cards, if not the coolest card from Pool 5 is Thanos. Thanos is a 6-cost, 8 power that reads, at the start of the game, shuffle the 6 Infinity Stones into your deck. So each of the Infinity Stones do something a little different, but a lot of them involve cycling or getting your other stones, as well as some other powerful effects like boosting up Thanos, transforming a location, reducing enemy cards' power, all that kind of stuff. So very thematic, very cool. This is one of the most difficult cards to evaluate in the game, as we've never seen an effect like this. At least with Galactus, when you get it off of Generation, you kind of are able, we've been kind of able to see what you can do with it, whereas Thanos, generating it doesn't matter because it's a start of the game effect. I do think he's definably going to be a new archetype, because if you're playing Thanos, you're going all in on Thanos, I think is going to be the plan. It's possible you could put him in existing archetypes, but I really don't know how well that's going to work, because I think a lot of existing decks really care about their deck size and don't necessarily want these stones clogging up their deck, even if the stones do cycle. Also, you have to factor in that the stones do take up space on your board. Now, you don't need them all in play to get the most value out of Thanos, but it's just going to be really interesting to see. I think this is one of the coolest cards they've ever made, and I'm very excited to see just how it ends up working out, because I think there are a lot of different ways you could build this deck, and it's not really going to be clear what the best ways to play around with it are until people really get to testing the card. But without a doubt, I think it's going to be spawning a new archetype, all focused around Thanos and the stones. Alright, and now we have our last card from Pool 4 here. That is going to be Titania. So, really sick card here that I'm excited for, and I think is just a flat good on its own. This card is very, very powerful and has a super unique effect we have not seen before. So it is a 1 cost for 5 power, so super above rate there, but whenever any card is played at this location, this card switches sides. Now there's some really strong stuff you can do with this. The first things that come to my mind are using this to drop at the end of the game, so you won't have to worry about it swapping sides. The more devious way to make use of it, I think, is going to be when your opponent has 3 cards in a lane, you can play Titania, follow up with something else. You will lock them out of being able to play a card in that lane, and then you can play a card on the final turn to bounce Titania back over to your side, while guaranteeing they aren't able to play a card in that location during their final turn. I think this is insanely powerful. I think it's going to see play in a wide variety of decks. Another one I think is going to be really good with this is going to be Cerebro 5 power Cerebro. Definitely one of my favorite decks, and I'm really excited to try this out in there. I think it's just a generally really good card. It's just something you have to be mindful of playing around it and how it works, because this is not a 1-drop you just want to slam on turn 1, even though I'm sure a decent amount of people are probably still going to do that. It's definitely a very interestingly designed card, and I think it has the potential to be one of, if not the strongest card from Pool 4. And we have our last card from Pool 5 here, and that is Valkyrie. So, Valkyrie is a 5 cost for 3 power, and she reads, set all cards at this location to 3 power. So very, very strong effect here. I think this is super neat, and this is one of my favorite cards from the new ones we're getting. It's just really, really neat having a card that cares about not only setting all your stuff to one particular power, but also your opponent's stuff. So you can use this to whittle down one of their lanes while buffing up one of yours. The big place I see this making kind of a new archetype is going to be Cerebro 3. So Cerebro 3 has been around for a while, but I definitely think it's been a lot worse than Cerebro 2, or I'd even say worse than Cerebro 5. It feels like the deck hasn't had enough good 3-power stuff, and this does everything you want to be doing in that kind of deck, where you're just going to be buffing up all your stuff to 3, or maybe your stuff got hit by a scorpion or something else where it lowered its power. This can negate that effect. Also make your opponent's stuff nice and small, so that way when you do go for your Cerebro buff, you're almost guaranteed to have more power than them. I also think this could spawn a new archetype that is about kind of countering your opponent's stuff, maybe a new variant of control. It definitely just seems like a very good tool that you can use against big decks, and it's not as one-dimensional as Shang-Chi, because you don't have to worry about your reveal order quite as much. Obviously, if they do play a big thing on the final turn, reveal order does matter. But I think in general, it's just a really, really strong card. And anytime you see an effect that impacts both of the sides of the board, if you can build your deck in a way to take advantage of that effect, when the opponent's deck isn't built to take advantage of that effect or actively suffers from that effect, I think you have a very, very powerful build around tool here. So I think you're going to see people trying this out in a large variety of ways. Personally, I'm most excited for maybe Cerebro 3 finally becoming a real deck, and with some other cards that we mentioned in here, like Maria Hill, maybe Silver Surfer, maybe Bast. I think Cerebro 3 has a lot going for it with these new cards. But yeah, that is our tier list for all the Pool 4 and Pool 5 cards. Definitely excited to try some of these out when they drop. Obviously, it seems like it is not going to be easy to get all of these cards right away, so definitely going to have to be careful about which ones we're picking and choosing here, especially the Pool 5 cards. But nonetheless, I'm really excited to see what they do in game, try stuff out with them, see how it changes the meta. Definitely let me know in the comments below which card you are most excited to build around. I'm really curious to see some neat deck building ideas, as I think there's a lot of potential with these cards, and it sounds like we're going to be getting quite a few new cards coming pretty regularly into these new pools, so I'll definitely have more stuff like this as we get more cards added to the pools. But yeah, that is going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.